I'll talk a little bit about how you create one, but at the end of the process, what you really want is, a document that starts with your key goals, right? The measures of success, why you're doing this initiative. We've talked about that. We probably beat that into the ground a bit, but that's what everything should fall off of. And then kind of the list of what are these best practices that you're going to implement, right? Either content or processes around data. You can be specific, and it doesn't have to be, it's whatever you've decided is important to you and your organization. And then a prioritized schedule for that implementation, right? We're going to do business glossary first, and then we're going to do catalog, or we're going to do business glossary and catalog, and then we're going to do this other thing, right? And having that well defined so that it's clear, like, this is what's happening, right? And you could say, hey, we're going to do everything at once, starting right away. I would say that might set you up for failure, but that's an option, just as long as it's clear and understood, and that they know that these best practices, how they kind of apply to those goals, which we'll talk about in a second. The next is a little bit more of a nuanced discussion, but it's also critical, which is talking about the rollout plan for each of these best practices. So we talk about multiple levels of scope in terms of your rollout. So you say, hey, we're going to implement a business glossary within our organization. Well, does that mean that you are going to start a business glossary in every part of your organization, HR and finance and sales and marketing and if you're a hospital, whatever your health, your provider information and all that kind of stuff is, are you going to do that everywhere, or are you going to start with just a smaller group, where you kind of have people who are sort of already bought in and eager, and you've got people who are interested in that and stewards, or maybe you've got a new reporting system you're implementing in one area and you kind of want to pilot it there. So that's the organizational scope. So saying, hey, I'm going to start in this one area and then expand, right? And the systems and tool scope says, hey, we're going to start in this one area, we're going to start in these 3 areas, but we're only going to focus on this one data system first, right? And it really depends on again, how you want to prioritize things, but that's the other thing that's important for that. And then lastly, in terms of the high level stuff, is you want to talk about what is your immediate action, right? So once you come up with this, you say, hey, this is what we're doing next. And this is kind of key, because this roadmap should be actionable, right? And you want to say, hey, we're going to begin with this actual, we're going to do a business glossary in this area, and we're going to do this in the next 90 days or something. I highly encourage people to have something that they roll out of this roadmap directly into that. This first set of information, the key goals and the best practices that you're implementing, and the schedule for that, in an ideal world, it's something that you can express in a 2 to 3 page document that you can share with key stakeholders and come back to multiple times. Like, well, where are we on this process? How are we doing it? Why are we doing this? And anyone who's sort of you're pulling into and you're asking to spend time on your data governance initiative, you can point them to a place on your website or do whatever. Like, this is why we're doing it, and I really appreciate the effort. And a lot of people, spend a lot of time in the weeds and documenting stuff way down there, and they don't have this top 2 to 3 page thing to fall back on. Or frankly, they've written a 30-page charter, project charter, that doesn't really, it's not something that any human's really going to want to read on a regular basis. So when you get a little bit lower level beyond this, you might have, it's good as part of this initiative to do a current state assessment. We'll talk about this as part of the overall process of how to create this, but you want to have in the document understanding just at a high level. It doesn't have to be really like, what are your primary data systems you're working with? What are the sort of tools and systems that people are working with? And what are the organizational resources that you have, right? So who's interacting with the data, who's doing this kind of stuff right now, who's writing reports, who's requesting reports, those kinds of stuff. These first 3 things are kind of information to inform the data governance process and your feasibility and availability. One thing that happens sometimes in doing an assessment and a roadmap for data governance is that people confuse that effort with an assessment and roadmap of your current reporting infrastructure, right? Now, it is hard to separate these 2 things, because a successful reporting infrastructure is greatly benefited by a good data governance process, but a good data governance process is agnostic to what tools you have, right? But it is very informative, and helpful to the data governance process to understand what those tools are, right? And so you want to go ahead and do that. But now if someone comes and says, hey, we're doing this and I want to understand I want an assessment of our, BI tool, like do we have the right tools? Are we, should we look at this reporting tool versus this reporting tool, or should we build a data warehouse versus not? Like that's not what this assessment's about. If you can, sometimes you can do those things together, but I just want to point out that pulling this information in is helpful to the data governance process, but I would separate out the initiative of trying to figure out whether or not your reporting tools and infrastructure are right, versus if you've got the right culture and understanding of your reporting tools and infrastructure. The second thing is understanding what data governance assets you may already have. So what people do you have who are engaged in data governance? Do you have committees or things that you could leverage, or are already doing some of this informally or formally? What processes already exist? Do you have a data request process? Do you have a security review process, or whatever might already exist, and identify that? People sometimes are very surprised at how many data governance activities actually occur just under kind of different names or informally. So I encourage you to add that. And then lastly, what content you may already have. Maybe you have a business glossary in one area, or other kind of silos of information that you can kind of bring into your data infrastructure. And then part of the assessment, which we'll talk about, is that you're going to be interviewing people and kind of listening to what's going on in your organization and what's working and not working. And when you do that, you're going to have these identified issues and themes, right? And this is a big driver for what those goals are too, right? Is to hear what's working and not working for people. And if you can have that kind of document in your current state, it's incredibly helpful for justification of the process. All right, the next kind of thing in the lower level detail is just some explanation of each one of these best practices you plan to implement. So, hey, we're going to do a glossary, or we're going to do a data request process, or a security panel review, or whatever it might be. And for each one of these to have just a slightly more deeper description of what that practice and process is. What are your desired outcome for that? Like, oh, we're going to create a business glossary, and this is going to help generate trust and consistency in the data, which is one of these identified goals, or whatever it may be. And describe the rollout phase in a little bit more detail for that. I think we're going to start with this area. Justification information from the assessment. So, this was identified by 30% of the people that has a major problem, or whatever, to help you. And then how to measure success. That we plan to have this implemented within 6 months, and that should help to reduce the amount of time for people to get reports from 10 days to 5 days. Right? And I'm making that up, but it's very hard to put those types of goals on. But if you've defined those goals, kind of set that out. Or even if it's like, this is a bit hard to do, but even if it's just saying like, we're going to do this, and there's with the goal of generally increasing the throughput of our reporting activity or something, but I recommend having this information document. Don't get too crazy with it, but after the 2 to 3 page document as a supplemental thing for people to understand what that is. So what to avoid? Now, I don't like to say ever like don't do this, because it really depends on your culture. Like, it might be that one of these things is the most important thing in the world to deal with based on what you've identified as issues. But just in our experience, people who come out of this assessment and roadmap and decide that the very first thing they want to focus on is writing policy and writing charters, and creating kind of additional non-actionable documentation, it is that doesn't tend to lead to success, right? The purpose of this is to let people more effectively use your data, and so you do it. Now, you might like policies is a bit of a if it's that we need to define what our privacy codes are, so that we can start assigning that, like that, that makes more sense. But I think just writing policies for policy's sake is not there. I think most of the time, if you start thinking about what your actionable tasks are in interacting with your data and governing your data, and you start coming up with what the minimum that you need in order to do that, then policies will follow. But again, it's up to your culture. And the other thing I try to encourage people is that when they put together the roadmap, is to not to avoid the curse of postponed perfection, right? You want to just have continuous improvement. So don't wait until you've got everything set up before you can start. Figure out how to begin right now in small areas or with small sets of content to begin getting things out. Also, when you do your assessment, don't only focus on problems. Look for things that are working but can be expanded. So when you're talking to people and listening to people on what they're doing and what challenges they have, also ask them what's working. Have you seen something that someone's done that has made this an improvement? And you might find out about things that were tried and worked but never expanded, or maybe only known by a couple people, and that can be a really good opportunity to get some quick wins to roll that out. This is a long topic considering how much time we have left, but I want to kind of bring this up. We have this concept of just-in-time data governance, right? And what we mean by that is another conflict that people say is that, let's talk about documenting reports. So you come into an organization that has, hundreds or thousands of reports that are built in a reporting tool, and they just have no control over it. They don't know what they are. Do they work? Do they not work? Who's using them? Who's not using them? And there's not a lot of context to what these reports are. They're just a bunch of SQL, and there's no sort of documentation for why they were built and what they're supposed to do and if they're doing what they're supposed to do. That's a common problem. So what you could say, like, what we really want to do is we want to create a report catalog to document our reports. So one method is that you could sit around and say, we're going to create an initiative to document all of the reports, right? And that's going to take you years, and you're going to get people who are very frustrated with it, and it's going to be a big challenge, and not really accomplish the goals that you want in the way that you're thinking about it. What we recommend as the kind of flip side of that is you want to document like your 20 to 50 critical reports that everybody uses on a regular basis. Get that information in, have people have a good model and understand what it means to have the kind of curation and oversight of what these things are. And you're guaranteed that the next day someone's going to come in and need to understand the 51st report, or some other report that you don't have curated, right? So what's important is to create a process with which, whenever someone encounters something that's not well documented, that's not well governed, that's not yet curated, to create a process with which they can request that it get curated and have it get curated immediately, like just in time. I mean, as quickly as your stewards are available. And that over time will create a wonderful documentation of all of the reports that you have, right? And that people care about, and do that kind of filtering for you instead of spending a whole bunch of time waiting for the perfection or having everything done. So that this concept of content over process is really important. So is that to create points of entry for people asking for things or needing things to be governed and curated, and have that happen quickly instead of waiting until every single thing is curated. And then lastly, don't overcomplicate, right? So you want to avoid things in your roadmap where you're focusing way too much energy up front on, oftentimes you see people who say, I want a 7-step approval process for a new definition, but really a 2-step process is there. This goes a little bit with just like feasibility discussions. All right, so there's a little bit of what you want to kind of, if you've written a document, you look it over and say, oh my gosh, I got a lot of stuff here that seems like overly complicated. Is this really the right strategy? The last thing to avoid is this concept, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's called Chesterton's fence. And it's just this concept that says, like, don't ever take down a fence until you know the reason why it was put up. You're like, oh, this thing's in the way. Like, it'd be so much faster if I walk through there. And then you take down that fence, and then a week later, all the cows are in town, eating all of the flowers in the town square, because that's why that fence was there, right? It kept the cows from getting out. And so that's the same thing too as you put together this plan. As you're looking at like what's going on, is that there might be some informal processes or things that are happening that are there for a reason, and it's a good thing to try to understand what that is before you totally throw things out or create bureaucracy where it's not necessary.